Collections at the Cranbrook Institute of Science. And once again, I've invited you to join me to take a look at one of the wonderful artifacts that is in the Institute's collection, but not on display. During this kind of quiet time at the Institute, this is a good chance to share with you just a few of the many thousands of artifacts and specimens that are held by the Institute in storage and very seldom seen by anyone but myself and a few other staff here at the Institute. Now, what I've pulled out for you this time around is a truly stunning pair of Native American moccasins. Now, the word moccasin is actually a word from the Algonquin language, and it essentially translates obviously as shoe. But we use the word, at least in general parlance, to describe shoes from many diverse Native American cultures all across North America. Of course, each of the many indigenous peoples will have their own word for shoe, but in the generic everyday usage, moccasin gets used. So these are moccasins, although that's not the word that would have been used for these shoes, by the makers who are native peoples of the Great Plains. So these are an artifact that's been with the Institute for quite a long time. They were donated in 1944 by a gentleman named Adolph Spohr. There are, of course, many different tribes on the Great Plains, or traditionally that resided on the Great Plains. And unfortunately, these are simply listed as from the Great Plains, unlike some of our moccasins, where we have a little bit closer identification. However, there are some characteristics of this particular pair of moccasins that provide clues as to what specific tribal group they might be with, or at least take their cues from. And I'm going to say one of the Sioux people, Lakota or Dakota perhaps. And why do I say that? Well, it has to do with a couple of features. Number one, moccasins in general were made in one of two ways. You can make them from a single piece of leather that would be brought up and over the foot and sewed down the center seam. The center seam style of moccasin was predominantly done by native peoples of the eastern portion of the continent. The other traditional way to do it would be to take a piece of leather and fold it this way and have the seam running here along the bottom edge of the foot, a side seam moccasin. And this was more characteristic of native peoples of the Great Plains. However, these are neither side nor center seam exactly. These have a separate sole of a rawhide rather than a tan buckskin or skin of some sort. These could be elk. And that suggests that these are Great Plains moccasins from the mid-19th century forward. That's when you see these separate, sturdier soles coming into play, either by sewing them onto a side seam moccasin, or as is the case here, sewn on as a solid sole to a softer leather upper. And so that suggests that these moccasins were made roughly after 1850. Now, the geometric patterns is very suggestive of Great Plains. Generally speaking, eastern or woodlands moccasins will be done in a floral design. That's not always true. There were certainly tribal peoples of the Great Plains who would do some floral or curved designs, but generally speaking, geometric designs are suggestive of the Great Plains. If I hold this moccasin up closer, you can see that the tongue of the moccasin is split into two. And that is something that is done on men's moccasins amongst the Dakota and Lakota, people sometimes known to the people as the Sioux. And that leads me to believe that these are Lakota or Dakota men's moccasins from 1854, perhaps to around 1900. Now, the beautiful designs include a kind of a stepped pyramid or diamond pattern here. Around the sole, you see that pattern repeated. If that is more symmetrical, it is sometimes suggestive of a teepee. This indeed may also represent a teepee. And then on the split tongues there, you see little box designs, and those are sometimes representative of parfleches, rawhide storage boxes that would have been a common feature in people's households of that time period. Now, obviously, there's a great deal of work to produce these moccasins. All of these individual little beads were acquired in trade and then would have to be stitched onto the moccasin using a couple of different techniques. Typically, this was a woman's craft, and it was a highly regarded art form and still is. At this point, I want to take the camera in and give you a real close look at these moccasins and talk a little bit about how they were produced and how the beads were stitched on. Alrighty, well, hopefully my iPad here does these wonderful moccasins justice. I'm going to try and bring it down in really tight so that you can see how the beads were stitched onto the leather. Hopefully you can see in detail as you look closely that there are really beads sewn on in rows with one little stitch going through the leather about every 4 to 8 beads depending, and these stitched rows come together to form the pattern. Now this style of stitching is called lazy stitch. Again, it's going to blur out a little bit. I do apologize for that. We'll try and get it in to see a real close look at that lazy stitch pattern. You could stitch the beads down every couple. That's of course a lot more work, and that was called a spot stitch. In the Southern Great Plains, you would see stitching done in a very laborious manner where you're interlocking the beads by going back and forth diagonally through each opposed row of beads. That is referred to as Peyote Stitch. Of course, many bead workers, probably most, would know all 3 stitches and use them where appropriate. If you had to do a design that covered a large area and didn't receive a lot of abuse, you might get away with the lazy stitch that you see here. If you wanted to do curved patterning or a little bit tighter stitching, you could do the spot stitch. And in certain instances, if you wanted a really tight, elegant pattern with the capability of doing some interesting designs, you might go with the Peyote Stitch. Now, these moccasins probably date from, well, let's say the 1870s, but there are still wonderful bead workers out there today doing beautiful beadwork. Sometimes they'll even stitch up Converse or other modern tennis shoes. I would encourage you to go online, take a look at other examples of both old and new moccasins and other Great Plains beadwork. And if you're so motivated, maybe you could buy yourself an incredible pair of these kicks. Do be prepared to pay a pretty good price, but appreciate the immense amount of skill needed and the many, many hours of work that would go into producing such a wonderful pair of footwear.